Well, welcome back to GB 102, and I hope you're ready for another exciting adventure exploring the lands of the Bible. Because in this lecture, we'll be looking at the areas controlled by the Israelite tribes of Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Issachar. And these areas became the central stronghold for Israel's northern kingdom, and the area is largely a mountainous area. In fact, it was so mountainous that one of Israel's neighbors, the Arameans, believed that Israel must worship mountain gods. At least that's how they figured according to 1 Kings 20 verses 23 through 25. So last week, we focused on a road known as the International Coastal Highway. But we also briefly introduced a road known as the Central Ridge Route. And today we'll be focusing primarily on this road that runs all along Israel's central ridge, connecting Jerusalem with the stronghold of Megiddo. So let's begin by locating and discussing the land of Benjamin. This is a small area, but it's also a very well populated area to the north and to the west of the Dead Sea. In many ways, the land of Benjamin served as a boundary between the northern tribes of Israel and the southern tribes and kingdom of Judah. And some commentators have even gone so far as to describe the land of Benjamin as Jerusalem's front porch, because Jerusalem is surrounded on the south, west, and east by mountains. And so the northern approach through the land of Benjamin is really the only way to get to Jerusalem. So let's pull out our red highlighter here and display on our big map exactly where the land of Benjamin is. Do you see it? It's that little red oval there in the center of the map. It's the land of Benjamin, and it may be hard to believe, but this small area constituted one of the most traveled and densely populated areas in all of the land of Israel. So let's zoom in now and have ourselves a look. As always, you'll want to download both the blank thumbnail map and the Saddle of Benjamin semi-transparent thumbnail map from your LMS. And, as we've done before, I'll cue your music while you retrieve those.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map. I'm the map, I'm the map. If there's a place you gotta get, I can get you there, I bet. I'm the map. I'm the map, 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 I'm the map!
There we go. Now that we've zoomed in, notice how many cities are packed into this area pretty tightly. The reason for all of this is actually because of the shape of the land itself. It looks like a saddle. The middle of the landform is a bowl-shaped depression. It's flat, it's fertile, and it's ripe for human settlements. The northern and southern ends of this depression are higher in elevation, while the western and eastern edges drop off steeply. If you're having trouble picturing this, maybe this will help. So, if you've never ridden a horse before, this is what a saddle looks like. Notice that a saddle has a horn in the front and a raised seat in the back. And also notice that the sides slope downward and therefore the legs spread out. So this is how the land is shaped. Jerusalem would sit on the high ridge which would be the seat rest if we were using this picture, while the land of Samaria begins around the horn area. To the west, the Beth Horon Ridge slopes downward into the Philistine Plain, and to the east, the road plunges into the Jordan River Valley towards the town of Jericho. So go ahead and pull out your Saddle of Benjamin thumbnail map, the one you just downloaded. It should look something like this. So now that you've got that, let's identify all of those areas we've just been discussing. Let's start with that bowl-shaped area. It's that circle with the semi-permeable lines there in the center. And it's dotted for a reason. And the reason is this. The land of Benjamin is not easily defined. And if you look it up in Bible atlases, they'll show this general shape, but the land that they mark will vary. So, like before, go ahead and mark the principal areas that surround the saddle of Benjamin. The Philistine plain that we saw last week is there to the west, as is a smaller place called the Shephelah. To the north, we have the land of Samaria. To the east, we have the downsloping Jordan River Valley. And to the south, we have the highlands of Judah. Now, unlike the areas that we looked at previously, the saddle of Benjamin does not have any major waterways, so we only need to investigate the roads that go through this area. Now, the most important by far is the north and south running road that connects Bethel to Jerusalem. This road is the Central Ridge route, and we looked at it briefly last week. It is the road that ran south from Megiddo and north from Hebron. Well, in the middle of all that is the saddle of Benjamin. So go ahead and mark your map as I've shown here. You may also want to take a moment to look up all the cities along this area. As before, we will only try to mark cities that are important to the Bible narratives, and each of these towns shows up in at least one major event within the biblical text. Now, besides the Central Ridge route, we'll also want to make note of some of the major east-west running roads. And the most important of these east-west roads, at least particularly by the New Testament era, was this route known as the Beth Horon Ridge route. This road follows the crest of some small mountains and a narrow ridge that goes all the way from Gibeon to Beth Horon, and then descends down into the Philistine plain where we discover small towns like Modin and Lod. So go ahead and pause your video here and look up a few of these places. Also, you may note that the spelling may differ from Bible to Bible translation. For example, the NIV spells the city of Gibeon, Gibeon, as Gibeon, Gibeon. Once again, this is a transliteration issue, and it is unfortunate that there's no uniform spelling for some of these cities. Also note that one of these towns on this list, Modin, is a major intertestamental city, and you will need a Bible with an Apocrypha that has the book of 1 Maccabees to look this reference up. And a final road we'll want to look at on this map is the Jericho Road. Now this is a steep and winding path that connects the city of Jerusalem with the city of Jericho. Jesus famously alluded to this path as a man was walking from Jerusalem down to Jericho when a group of robbers attacked him, and he is eventually helped by a good Samaritan. So, let's pause the video here again and mark this road as well. So, your completed map should look something like this. All roads and cities, but no major mountains or waterways. And also notice that we've added a possible location for the town of Emmaus there to the west of Jerusalem. It's a small village where Jesus appeared to two of his disciples after he'd risen from the dead. And all we really know for certain is it's about 6 to 7 miles away from Jerusalem. As always, if it appears on a map, it could appear in a quiz. So take time to look at these maps thoroughly and memorize the locations and the key cities and roads. So, with that first map out of the way, let's talk about the land of Benjamin itself and point out 3 characteristics that you should know about this area. The first characteristic that we've already mentioned is that the land is shaped like a saddle. Its upper rims on both the north and the south are about 3,000 feet above sea level, and the flat base or depression there in the middle, where most of the cities are, is about 2,600 feet above sea level. And also note that your maps from the first week that this area is a highly concentrated area of Cenomanian limestone, and it receives about 20 to 30 inches of rain per year. This means that the farms in this area will be supported by rich terra rosa soils, and that all of the cities can be built up with high limestone walls for defense. And, well, these fortifications will be very necessary because of our second point. And that point is that the Saddle of Benjamin is a strategic crossroads. If a person wanted to conquer either the lands of Judah or the land of Samaria, they would need to control the Saddle of Benjamin in general, and they would specifically want to control the intersection where the Central Ridge route and the Beth Horon Ridge route meet. And this is one of the one of the earliest accounts of Levantine geography, puts it this way, and it's a very poetic perspective. It's from a guy named G.A. Smith, and he puts it this way, quote, "The land is a debatable land, across which most of the accessible frontier of Judea fluctuated, and therefore seems to be the site of more fortresses, sieges, forays, and battles and massacres than perhaps any other part of the country." Unquote. And just for one example of this, when Joshua leads the Israelites into the Promised Land, he began the invasion by taking a city called Ai. Some people think it's modern-day Bethel. And he did this to split the land into north and south divisions. You can read more about this in Joshua chapter 8. You can also see in the pages of your textbook, specifically pages 77 through 78, that really the takeaway point I want you to get is this, that if you can control the saddle of Benjamin, it gives your army a strategic advantage whether you're going marching against the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah. And I'm sure because you've had to mark quite a few cities, you're probably able to guess what our final point about the saddle of Benjamin is going to be already. It's that this area is densely populated. The cities of Bethel, Mizpah, Ramah, and Gibeah are hugely important to the Old Testament narratives, and particularly to the administration of Samuel the prophet, who traveled through this area extensively as he was administering justice during the final years of the period of the Judges. Each of these cities in the saddle of Benjamin played an important role in the development of Israelite history and culture. And I would go so far as to say that knowing these cities is probably more important than most of the other towns we'll cover in class, simply because of how frequently they show up in the biblical text. So you got all that? Now that we've discussed the saddle of Benjamin, let's shift some gears here and let's look to the north to a very large area of land known as Samaria. Traditionally, this was the tribal allotment for Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And the Ephraimites were so successful that the northern kingdom of Israel often just got abbreviated to being called Ephraim. After the kingdoms of Israel split in two into north and south in 930 BC, the land of Samaria will become the seat of power for just about every king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And so, depending on which king is in charge, the cities of Shechem, Tirzah, or Samaria took their turn at being the capital city of this northern kingdom. Now, by the New Testament times, this area will be the homeland of a semi-Jewish people known as the Samaritans. So, go ahead and pause your video and download the two thumbnail maps for Samaria, and I'll serenade you with the music and zoom in to the shaded area on our map here.
Oh, I'm the map. I'm the map. I'm the map.
So, at this level of magnification, you may already see a few places that you recognize. There's Megiddo and Dothan, which showed up on the Mount Carmel map near the northern end of this map. While Bethel, which we saw in the Saddle of Benjamin map, is on the southern end of this map. And this will be a trend we'll see throughout this class, that our maps will have some areas of overlap, and many of the major cities will show up on 2 or 3 different maps. And this is intentional for 2 reasons. The first is that I want you to learn to see these major cities from several different directions. But the second reason is that when you do your final project, you may need to incorporate multiple maps. And so I want you to get used to seeing where one map stops and a new map begins. So let's begin by defining the land of Samaria. To the west is the land we've already explored, the coastal plain, also known as the Plain of Sharon. To the north is another familiar feature, Mount Carmel. Also notice that Mount Carmel, also to the north, there's also this area called the Jezreel Valley. So the land of Samaria is actually large enough to really have 2 borders, Mount Carmel to the northwest, while Jezreel Valley is more appropriately directly north. To the east, we have a steady drop-off into the lower Jordan Valley, and to the south, we have the Saddle of Benjamin, which we were just looking at. Also notice that the scale of this map is a lot bigger than the Saddle of Benjamin, which we were previously working on. the land of Benjamin is only about 10 miles wide, while the land of Samaria is about 50 miles long by 40 miles wide. So now let's identify the major waterways in the land of Samaria. And the first we'll look at is this place called the Wadi Farah. It's a river that runs east and south from the major city of Tirzah and spills down into the Jordan River Valley. We saw this area last week, and we discussed it as one of the possible routes that Naaman the Syrian could have taken when he traveled from the city of Samaria to the west bank of the Jordan River. So let's go ahead and pause this video and mark the Wadi Farah as I've shown here. Next, all the way up in the upper northeast corner of the map, we have another river known as the Wadi Harod. This is a river that Gideon took his troops to when he was fighting the Midianites. As Judges chapter 7 verse 5 records, Gideon was told that he could only take a few soldiers with him. So he had to take them down to this river, and only the ones that stooped down to lap up the water like a dog were ones that he was allowed to take. And according to the text, only 300 men drank the water in such an unsophisticated matter. And this will foreshadow a point of a later lecture here, much later in the class, that the biblical text emphasizes that God can use any number of people to win a battle, small or large. And the reason for this is so that the people of God did not become overconfident in their own skills. So, in addition to these major waterways, we need to cover three major mountains that keep showing up in the biblical text. To the north of this map, we see a huge backward-shaped sea area. This is known as Mount Gilboa, and it is the place where Israel's first king, Saul, was mortally wounded by Philistine archers. To the south, though, we find two major mountains. The one to the north is Mount Ebal, and the one to the south is Mount Gerizim. These two mountains were the location of a covenant renewal ceremony that's described in Joshua chapter 8. Half of the Israelites were to stand on Mount Ebal, while the other half were to stand on Gerizim. Together they were to recite back and forth the blessings and the curses of the law of Moses back to each other. And this apparently left a very lasting impression on the people, because even by the New Testament era, the Samaritans are still worshiping at a temple that was built on Mount Gerizim. So at this point, go ahead and pause your video here and mark the mountains as I've shown here. Now that we've got those mountains marked, let's take a look at the major road running through Samaria. This is, of course, the Central Ridge route. So starting at Bethel there in the south, this road goes north to the city of Shechem, which is a holy city that lies in between the mountains of Gerizim and Ebal. Next, the road turns to the west and heads towards the city of Samaria. After that, the road turns back north to the cities of Dotan and Beth Hagan. Sometimes it also reaches Ibleam as well, so that's not a hard and fast drawing there. But then finally, the road turns northwest and connects with the International Coastal Highway in the city of Megiddo. So go ahead and pause your video here and mark the route in green, connecting all of these major cities together. And while we're at it, we might as well mark all the cities. So just in case you haven't figured it out, this week we will have a lot of cities to memorize. In addition to these cities on the Central Ridge route, you also want to be familiar with Shiloh. This is the city where the Ark of God came to rest during the period of the Judges. You should also be familiar with a city known as Bet Shan, which is located in the northeast corner of the map. This is a massive stronghold on the banks of the Wadi Harod. Finally, you'll need to know the city of Tirzah. This became the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel during the reign of King Baasha. So go ahead and pause your video here one more time and make sure that you have all of the cities labeled that I've marked here. And if you're feeling really intrepid, go ahead and take some time and look up these cities and see how they played a part in God's story through various biblical passages. But in particular, there's three cities you'll really want to get down. You'll want to memorize that Shechem, Tirzah, and Samaria are the three capital cities of the northern kings of Israel. Okay, so how do you feel about that? Your finished map should look something like this. Now the good news for you is going to be this, that this is going to be one of the more complex maps that we're going to have with regard to numbers of cities and points of interest. The bad news is that your quiz will have cities and landmarks from this map and the Saddle of Benjamin together. So study your maps carefully, because that is a lot of cities to have to go through. But the payoff will be that when you begin to see new maps, many of them will overlap with these maps that we've already done. So now that you've got that out of the way, let's discuss the three major aspects of the land of Samaria that you'll need to know for this class. And the first point we'll get about Samaria is that Samaria is a special blend of mountains and valleys. The mountains in the land of Samaria are very important areas to both the pre-exilic Israelites in terms of strategic importance and religious importance. Now, as we've already discussed, Mount Ebal and Gerizim were religiously important in both the New and Old Testament times. The city of Shechem was built up because of the importance of the two mountains, and the Ark of the Covenant would come to dwell in the city for a time after the conquest of Joshua was put on hiatus. But also notice from this picture that I've got on the slide that the mountains cradle cities. In the land of Samaria, the valleys are often small little hollows, offering great protection for cities, and they frequently gave access to water as well. And two of Israel's main capital cities, Shechem and Tirzah, are built in just such locations. Small valleys sheltered the cities, while large mountains offered protection and barriers from foreign invasions and from severe weather. So now, if you take a moment to match your Samaria map up to the map we did last week concerning the bedrocks of the Levant, you also notice that, like the Saddle of Benjamin, central Samaria is mostly Cinnamanian limestone, while it's got some Eocene limestone and chalk on the edges of this land. But for the most part, it's Cinnamanian limestone. And this means that the hills will have an abundance of terra rosa soils, which are decent for farming all sorts of Mediterranean-style fruits and vegetables like grapes, olives, and figs. Now, the slope of the mountains present a problem, though, because farmers simply don't want their topsoil to erode away every time it rains. So to compensate for the slopes, a practice known as terrace farming has been the solution for thousands of years. Basically, a farmer will build small retaining walls, mostly made of rock, and this will create level areas on the mountain, almost resembling stair steps. And these flat places will allow farmers to plant crops, while the stones keep the topsoil from eroding down the mountain. Now, our final point for Samaria is that Samaria is a syncretistic area. You see, in the land of Samaria, the biblical text constantly remarks about how the Israelites had a habit of committing religious compromise with paganism. Frequently, the Israelites will indulge in a practice known as syncretism, and this is what happens when you blend religious ideas together to form a new type of religion. For example, King Jeroboam I built a golden calf at Bethel, and he did so to keep the people from traveling to Jerusalem every year to worship. And he specifically tells them in 1 Kings 12, he says, "This is the God who brought you out of Egypt." See, he's taking golden calf worship, but he's also trying to blend it with what they know about Israel's God having delivered them from Egypt. Later, kings like Ahab will marry Sidonian princesses, particularly Ahab married Jezebel, and she will bring her gods Baal and Asherah with her. In fact, syncretism will be so common that it will make up the majority view of most of the people in Israel's northern kingdom, causing many of the real prophets of Yahweh to blast syncretism, and they'll call it spiritual prostitution. And if you want a rather explicit example of this, the whole book of Hosea suffices. And we'll see this trend continuing all the way up until the New Testament age, as the Samaritans, who were a racial mix between the Israelites and some Assyrians, see 2 Kings 17 for more on that, These Samaritans built a competing temple in the town of Sychar, which is along the base of Mount Gerizim. Okay, you still hanging in there with me? Good, because we still have one more area to cover, and then we can get to some of the more fun application aspects of this class. Our third area is known as the Jezreel Valley, sometimes known as the Valley of Esdraelon, and it provided a second major crossroads and access point into the land of Samaria. This area is flat, and it's flanked by Mount Carmel, the hills of Samaria, and the hills of Galilee, and it's the area that's highlighted in red here on this map. So, by now you know the drill. Go ahead and download your 2 thumbnail maps of the Jezreel Valley, and we'll mark up our final map of the day.
Oh, I'm the map. I'm the map. I'm the map.
I'm the map, I'm the map. Oh, gee. That song is just a gift that keeps on giving now, ain't it? So, there you go. We've zoomed in. By now, you're probably recognizing quite a number of landmarks. You see that large bony finger there of Mount Carmel? You see the cities of Megiddo, Yokneam, Ibleam, and Beth Hagan? We've seen them all before. See that curvy mountain peak down there? That's Mount Gilboa. See, you already know half this map already. So let's go ahead and define the borders here of the Jezreel Valley. So like before, let's begin in the west. The western border of the Jezreel Valley is Mount Carmel. To the north, we have the smaller hills of Lower Galilee. To the east, we have the Lower Jordan Valley and a rather steep drop-off into the Jordan River. And to the south, we find Samaria and Mount Carmel. So keep this in mind about places like Mount Carmel, that any large land features may take up multiple directions. And this is certainly true with Mount Carmel, as it's big enough to support both the western border of the Jezreel Valley and part of the southern border as well. Alright, so now let's look at the waterways. There's going to be 3 major rivers that we want to look at, and yes, we've seen all 3 of them in previous lectures. The first is the Kishon River along the northern border there of Mount Carmel. The second river we want to look at is the Crocodile River, which forms the dividing border between the plain of Dor and the plain of Sharon. And yes, notice that the Crocodile River does not enter the Jezreel Valley. So you may be asking, why are we marking it? Well, quite frankly, the map is big enough and it covers that area. And I want you to have the experience of, if something is big enough to see it on multiple maps, get in the habit of repeating it. It'll help you to memorize these features better. And finally, on this map, we get a more centered and better look at the Wadi Harod. This is a stream that begins in a city called Jezreel. Go figure, right? It's in the Jezreel Valley. And it rushes down and out of the valley into the Jordan River. Here's also a picture of the Wadi Harod, taken from the air as it flows past Mount Gilboa. So, with those 3 in mind, go ahead and pause the video and make sure you've got all 3 of these rivers marked in blue. So next, let's mark some mountains, and we'll mark those in our pink highlighter here. We already know 2 of the mountains to the south. We see Mount Carmel there on the western border of this map, and we see Mount Gilboa on the southern area of the map. But we need to add a few mountains on this northern end of the map, which is also the southern end of Lower Galilee. Now, the largest of these 2 outcroppings we want to note is Mount Morah, which is just to the north of the Wadi Harod. The second mountain is Mount Tabor. It's the small circle directly north of Mount Morah. So go ahead and pause the video and make sure we've marked these mountains as well. Alright, next up, let's mark some highways. Of course, by now, you probably can draw the Central Ridge route in your sleep. It ends at Megiddo, and so go ahead and mark your map as we've got here. And if you like, you can have the road connect to either Ibleam or Beth Hagan. Technically, either one is correct, as major roadways do go through both. Next, let's look at the International Coastal Highway. As we've seen before, it runs directly through the Jezreel Valley, up through Mount Carmel to Megiddo, but then it curves in between Mount Tabor and Mount Morah. This mountain pass allows for relatively easy passage to the Sea of Galilee and to the Hula Basin further to the north, but it's also a very easily defensible pass. So, you know the drill. Pause the video, mark your roads like I've got shown here. Alrighty, and now for the real doozy. On this map we have 10 cities to mark. Now the good news is you've already seen 6 of them on other maps. Caesarea Maritima, Dor, Yokneam, Megiddo, Ibleam, Beth Hagan. This is all old hat to you. But as we move north, we got 4 newcomers we got to study. And of these 4 sites, Sepphoris is the most important for New Testament studies. Now, don't get me wrong, this city is never mentioned in the Bible. However, it's a large city. It's the capital city of the area of Galilee. And dozens of archaeologists, including Mid-Atlantic's own Dr. Bob Smith, have dug here for years on end. And so keep Sepphoris in mind, because many people who study the culture of Galilee will get their ideas from digs that have happened at Sepphoris. Now, the other 3 cities that are on this map do show up in the biblical text. For example, there's Nazareth up on that high ridge there. And, of course, this is Jesus' hometown that shows up in Luke 4, verse 16. Jezreel, there near the middle of the map, was a major town that grew up around the spring that feeds the Wadi Herod, also known as the Spring of Herod. And you can read more about that in 1 Samuel 29:1. And then finally, there near the Jordan Valley is the large town of Bet Shan. This is a massive fortress that guarded the eastern slopes of the Jezreel Valley, as well as the western bank of the Jordan River. Now, when King Saul is killed on Mount Gilboa, there near Bet Shan, the Philistines will hang his corpse on the wall of Bet Shan, at least according to 1 Samuel 31:10. So, that's a lot of cities. Go ahead and pause your map and make sure you've got them all as I've got listed here. So, I hope you've got all that. That's our final map for the day. Your finished project should look something like this. For your quiz this week, you'll have 4 maps, and they're all fair game. The Saddle of Benjamin, the Samaria map, the Jezreel Valley map, as well as the Mesopotamia map we looked at in the previous lecture. So, study hard, my friends. The dividends will pay off bit by bit when you start recognizing that these maps do overlap, and many cities that you've got memorized are already in your head. So let's conclude the learning part of this lecture by noting the 3 points of interest about the Jezreel Valley. Firstly, the Jezreel Valley is one of the few east-west trend breakers in the Levant. As we saw from our first week's lecture, most of the travel that happens in the Levant goes north to south, simply because the mountains are cumbersome and in the way of traveling east to west. Now, Jezreel Valley is one of those few exceptions, and it is certainly the most traveled east-west corridor in all of the Levant. And the reason for this is because the valley is deep and it's wide. It's about 20 miles wide by 20 miles across. And the valley offers excellent mobility to armies who have, coincidentally, chosen this spot to pitch their battles simply because there's adequate room to spread out and put up a good fight. Also note that the valley has mountains on 3 sides, and this will restrict access into the valley to small strategic choke points. And our second point about the valley is that it is a flat, flooded farmland. The entire valley floor is made up of alluvial deposits, and the entire area gets somewhere between 30 to 40 inches of rain a year. Not bad, really. And this will make the area excellent for farmland. Well, so long as armies aren't battling and destroy it. But even more than armies, there's something else that makes farming here difficult. Too much water. Water that falls here tends to pile up and stagnate because the area is so flat, and it has relatively poor drainage. There's only 2 rivers that run out of this area. The Kishon River, which runs out to the west, and the Wadi Herod, which runs out to the east. And so the Jezreel Valley can become a very marshy place if humans don't regularly drain the water off and irrigate it manually. And finally, like the Saddle of Benjamin, the Jezreel Valley is a strategic crossroads as well. The mountains keep travelers from entering the valley at just any old place, and so all the roads have to go through very well-fortified choke points. Now, you've already seen all the ones in the south, Megiddo, Yokneam, Beth Hagan. All of those places are major fortresses that form barriers to get through Mount Carmel. Now, Mount Tabor is also narrow, very easy to defend in the north, and the Kishon River and the Wadi Harod become so marshy that it slows down travelers going east to west. So, you will want to know these 6 locations because several Bible stories revolve around people trying to gain access to this valley or to control one of these 6 choke points. So, if I've done my job right, you are pretty cross-eyed by now, and you're tired of doing maps for one day. And I invite you to just sit back now and just listen for a bit. For this, we're going to give a second example of what a successful final project may look like. And for this, we'll focus on the Old Testament text, which tells of the faithful servant of Abraham and how he honorably did his duty for his master and for his master's son. This narrative can be found in Genesis chapter 24, and the majority of the story, the main character is Abraham's chief servant, whose name is Eliezer of Damascus. And as best we can estimate, this whole event took place sometime between 2150 BC, a time when I think is close to when Abraham tried to sacrifice Isaac, and 2030 BC, just before the birth of Esau and Jacob, Isaac's sons. There will also be a lot more travel in this narrative than in the last one. So instead of using one of our smaller maps, we're going to use the bigger Mesopotamian map that we worked out earlier in the week. Also, our basic point for this presentation is that God shows over and over again that He is a faithful God, and that He follows through with His promises, even in cases where the circumstances would lead to difficulty or heartache. And because of this, a corollary point is also true, that the people of God who experience God's faithfulness tend to be people who exhibit faithfulness in their own way. So let us begin by introducing Psalm 136. It's a psalm that extols God's character. In this psalm, every verse ends with this repeated phrase, "His loyal love endures." Of course, many of you are probably more familiar with the Chris Tomlin version of the song Forever, which the NIV translates, "Your love endures forever." In either case, notice that the psalm teaches that God's loyal love lasts no matter the circumstances. He gave the land of Israel. His love endures forever. He remembers us when we are down. His love endures forever. He gives food to all living things. His love endures forever. So let us all give thanks. His love endures forever. And to this we could probably add the testimony of John 13, which states that when it came time for Jesus to depart this world to the Father, having loved His own while they were in the world, He now loved them to the very end. Unquote. So Jesus takes the job of a humble servant, and He washes His disciples' feet, even Judas's feet, the one who would betray Him in the end. And this is why I believe that it is not simply enough to translate Psalm 136 as His love endures forever. His love is more than just compassion and graciousness. God's love is loyal, even to the point where if people are not necessarily being loyal back, He is still loyal. Simply put, this is the sort of love that is a facet of God's personality. It's intrinsic to its being. And it's not just enough to say that God shows loyal love. As a Christian, we also affirm that God is loyal love, and it is the kind of love that endures forever. So for our word study today, I want us to delve a little deeper into this word for loyal love. In Hebrew, the word is pronounced hesed. And if you look it up in lexicons or concordances, you'll note very quickly that this word can be translated into English multiple ways. For example, The NIV translation offers 24 different definitions for the word, ranging from compassion to mercy to loyalty to loving kindness and even devotion. And this wide range of possible meanings tells me that the word has a much wider semantic range than we're used to in English, simply because we don't have a single word to put all these ideas succinctly. Now, in one of my favorite commentary books that I use, the New International Dictionary of the Old Testament Theology, it notes that this word hesed is used 3 times more often to describe something that God does as opposed to something that humans do. And indeed, when Moses uses this word to describe God in Exodus 34:6, it shows that it's part of the core of God's very nature. But this word can be applied to human beings as well. And so what this tells me is that hesed is a communicable attribute of God. And by this I mean simply that humans can exhibit it imperfectly. So this hesed is something that God is naturally, but it's also something that we as human beings can show and even experience from one another from time to time. And in this text today, we're going to see this interplay at work. Abraham's servant has already experienced God's covenant keeping. He knows that Abraham's Lord is loyal, compassionate, promise-keeping, and loving towards Abraham. So, when that servant is given a very important assignment, he too displays hesed, even when disloyalty could have been advantageous or a temptation to him. So, it may help to bridge the gap by looking at this word from a New Testament angle. In Matthew 25, Jesus gives us a parable of the talents. He describes a rich master who is going away on a journey, and he gives 3 slaves control over a portion of his property. The master is gone for a long time, and the good servants invest the master's possessions, and they end up with more than they started. The wicked servants, conversely, do not manage what they've been given all that well. So when the master returns, he rewards the servants who have made gains with his money. Specifically, he calls them good and faithful. Now, while this story is recorded in Greek, so the word hesed is not used here since that's a Hebrew word, I think the concept here is the same. The good servants are faithful to their master, even when he isn't looking. And this is the kind of integrity, I think, that is implied by the word hesed. It is not simply having faith in the master, who in this case would be God. It's being faithful to the master, even when he's perceived as being distant or absent. And if I may simplify this further, true love and fidelity is what people show you when you're not there to give or to get a reward. Anyone can fake it when the boss is around, but true integrity is the kind of person you are when no one is looking. So, this brings us to the hero of this particular story, and it's a man by the name of Eleazar of Damascus. Now, this name is only mentioned once in Scripture, and it's mentioned in Genesis 15:2. And in this text, Abraham laments to God that he has no son, and so the heir of his property will be one of his slaves, a man named Eleazar. Now, keep in mind, Abraham is well over 70 years old when he tells this lament to God. And at this point, his wife Sarah is older than 65. Now, if I were a betting man, it looks like pretty good odds for Eleazar. In fact, this is about as close as a person could come to winning the slavery lottery. We'll call it that. Abraham is one of the richest men in the world at the time. He has no blood heir, and Eleazar stands to get all the money, livestock, and even Abraham's other slaves the moment the old man dies. To be honest, for Eleazar, this is about as good as it could get. But then, here in Genesis 15, God makes a promise to Abraham. And sure enough, by the time Abraham is 99 years old, he finally has a son. So think about how Eleazar must have felt. Not only had his master Abraham lived for another 25 years, but now he had a son, and any hope that Eleazar could have had to make it big is gone. Would he be a slave forever, as Isaac would inherit him as his property once Abraham died? Well, It's an interesting question, but notice what's going on here in the background. Eleazar saw that God had kept his promise. And he kept his promise even when our common sense today would say, God, that's impossible. So now let's turn to our text in Genesis 24. Go ahead and pause the video here and read the entire text from verses 1 through verse 67. Oh, wait, and no, I won't even play the door music for you, so you get a reprieve from that as well. All right, so now that you've got all that, notice that Eleazar's name is not mentioned in this particular text. Throughout, the servant is only called Abraham's eldest servant. And it's quite common for commentators, though, to suggest that this servant has to be Eleazar. At least that's the common consensus. Also note that Abraham has a very important task for Eleazar. He has to get a wife for his son Isaac, and he's being asked to travel several hundreds of miles back to Haran to find her. Now try to imagine what could be going through Eleazar's mind here. This would make his defeat complete. Once Isaac has inherited all of Abraham's stuff, and he has a wife and children, well, quite frankly, Eleazar and his family can theoretically stay slaves for generations once Isaac has children. So, Abraham seems to sense that this is a pretty severe task, and he seals the deal with an oath. Now, I'm sure all of you are wondering, what does it mean in this text for Eleazar to swear an oath by putting his hand under Abraham's thigh? Well, you'll be sorry you asked, but if I can shoot straight with you here for a moment, in all likelihood, Abraham has just asked his servant to swear an oath by touching his circumcised penis. Ew. Yeah, I probably should have warned you the first week, but most of the Old Testament is rated PG-13 or worse. So, while there are several theories for why Abraham asked Eleazar to do this, I'll at least give you my theory. In the Old Testament times, people swore on holy objects. They swore on God's name, which we find in Joshua 2:14. They swore on God's temple, we see this in Matthew 23:16, and they would even swear by heaven itself. See James 5:12. Well, long before there was a temple, or even the Ten Commandments or an Ark of the Covenant, there was the sign of God's covenant, and that sign was circumcision. And my guess is that Abraham makes his servant swear in this fashion simply because there simply is no other holy object for a man to swear upon yet. Circumcision is the most concrete symbol that God has revealed up to this point, and by golly, they were going to swear on it. So now, let's look at the route that Eleazar might have taken. We know from the end of chapter 24 and verse 62 that Isaac lives in the Negev. And other passages describe the area somewhere between Kadesh and Bered. Of all these places, we only know certainly where Kadesh is. And we know that this area is far to the south of the city of Jerusalem. So on this map, we've marked the starting point somewhere in the south of Jerusalem in the Negev. And since we don't know exactly, we don't need to be too exact here. A hand grenade range will suffice. So, in all likelihood, Eleazar will take the Central Ridge route that we've been studying until he reached Megiddo. And this makes the most sense of the data that we have, because Abraham and his family will frequently travel this way, see Genesis 21. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, will travel this way in Genesis 28:19. And it just makes geographical sense. If Eleazar is starting off in the mountains of the south, he will not want to come down off the mountains into these more populated areas so long as he's moving gold and other valuable items. And unlike Naaman, who we saw last week, Eleazar isn't bringing a large armed escort with him. So, once he gets to Megiddo, Eleazar would have probably taken the International Coastal Highway around the Sea of Galilee up to the city of Damascus. From there, he would continue traveling north until he reached Carchemish and the Great Euphrates Depression. And from there, it would be a relatively flat jaunt over to the city of Haran, there on the banks of the Balak River. So all totaled up, a one-way journey of this scale is about 750 miles. That's roughly the distance between Charlotte, North Carolina, and Albany, New York. And that is a long haul, my friends, by walking or riding standards. And all totaled up, this journey probably took about 75 to 100 days. So keep this in mind. While it only took you about 15 minutes to read this account, it probably took Eleazar about 2/3 of a year to make this journey up to Haran and then back again. So while we're discussing this 750-mile trip, we should also note Eleazar's mode of transportation. The biblical text says that he brought 10 camels and an undetermined amount of men. See Genesis 24:32. And my guess is that he has a rider per camel, but it's not unheard of for there to be only one rider for every 2 camels. And this is the position my friend in Cincinnati, an Old Testament scholar by the name Dan Dyke, he favors this interpretation that we are actually having 5 riders and 10 camels, so that the camels can basically be a version of the Pony Express. A rider could ride 1 camel and then switch camels once the first appeared to be tiring out for the day. And this may indicate that Eleazar is on a speed run. He's trying to accomplish this task as fast as possible. Well, regardless of the speed of travel, Eleazar is certainly traveling in style. A scholar by the name of Obed Browski notes that this form of camel travel is not just the fastest type of pack animal, it's also a status symbol, demonstrating that Eleazar is representing a patron of significant wealth. And the biblical text supports this, as the gifts that Eleazar gives to Rebekah would be worth about $8,000 in today's market. Oh, and while we're on the subject of camels, we also need to discuss a recent set of articles that were published in 2013. According to some researchers doing carbon-14 dating, they concluded that camels were first introduced into the land of the Levant around 900 BC. And this, of course, raises a question for us, because the text states that Abraham owned at least 10 camels around 2000 BC. And I bring this up to you because you, as my students, are pursuing a degree in biblical studies. And when you graduate, this will be part of your job as educated Bible readers and scholars, that you'll have to enter dialogues with scholars that make such claims. So how do we deal with this evidence? Well, I'd first like to point out that these scholars in question did try to cast their findings in the most negative light possible by saying that the Bible is not historically accurate. Well, it's telling to me that they didn't dialogue with 2 other possible alternative interpretations. And the first is that the text of Genesis makes a pretty big deal about how wealthy Abraham has become. This text could be saying that Abraham has become so wealthy he even owns exotic animals. Animals so rare they just won't come into common usage till about 1,000 years later. And this first interpretation hinges upon the understanding that just because the earliest evidence we have for camels is 900 BC, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's proof that they didn't exist in small numbers at other times or places. Simply put, absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. And the second possibility is that this word, gamal, may have other definitions than the dromedary of southern Arabia. Now, I do find this interpretation a little bit more of a long shot, but if it turns out to be true, this wouldn't be the first time that a fairly rare word in the Old Testament has been mistranslated for centuries. So now, camels out of the way, let's get back to our hero Eleazar. Once again, Eleazar arrives in Haran, and he must still find a direct, unmarried female descendant that's related to Abraham. And Haran's a big city. Will he find a descendant? Will they still even live in this area after all these years? Well, in light of all these issues, Eleazar makes a prayer to the Lord. And interestingly, he appeals to God's hesed, or his loyal love. He acknowledges that Abraham's God has been faithful to Abraham in the past, and he appeals to this faithfulness here in the present. He explains a very specific set of circumstances that he would like to see happen, and he prays that as such things come to pass, that he will know for certain that God has chosen a suitable bride for Isaac. Now, more importantly, it will also show to Eliezer, Isaac, and Abraham that God is continuing to show covenant faithfulness time and time again. Now, personally, I find this prayer to be very interesting. Eliezer may not be like you and I. He doesn't have access to thousands of pages of biblical text telling over and over again that God is a promise-keeping God. All he has is all he's seen. But you know what? That's enough. He knows that Abraham's God is the kind of deity who keeps his promises, even when biology and common sense says it can't be done. And to this, I'd also like to add an admonition. God doesn't just show his hesed for his own sake. He shows his hesed so that we have an example to follow. Because Abraham's God is a God of covenant loyalty, Abraham's servants also exhibit this learned behavior as well. So, when Eliezer is wrapping up his prayer, then Rebekah approaches. And I find it interesting that the situation that Abraham's servant has prayed for is, well, to be honest, unlikely. He has prayed that the woman that God has chosen will approach him, will draw water from the well, and offer it to both Eliezer and his camels. Okay, I know, I can't stop talking about camels today. But according to some Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias, a camel can drink anywhere between 5 to 7 gallons of water every day. And keep in mind, water weighs 8 pounds per gallon. And this means that when Rebekah makes this offer to go fetch water for the camels, she's committing to lifting about 400 pounds of water. And my guess is her container probably only holds about 1 to 3 gallons at a time. And I also find it interesting that as she's doing this, Eliezer just watches. And the text says he does so to find out if his journey will be successful. What's he watching for? Is he watching to see if she's going to complain? Is he looking to see if she's going to be stingy with the water? Well, the text doesn't say. But the servant is so impressed that when it's all said and done, he offers her the bride price right there on the spot in the form of a gold nose ring and bracelets. Again, worth about $8,000 in today's currency. So now, after all this happens, Eliezer is invited to Rebekah's home. Laban and his family set food before Abraham's servant, but by this point, he's a man on a mission. He's almost to his goal. So before the pleasantries and the hospitality can happen, Eliezer has a story to tell. And notice that throughout this text, he retells the story nearly word for word. He recounts how God has shown hesed to Abraham in his old age by giving him a son. He explains how God has shown him hesed by helping him to meet Rebekah so quickly. And then he recounts that he has worshipped God because of this faithful love. And then, it's almost as if someone has taught this man how to preach. He looks to Laban and his family and he asks, "Will you be like God and show Abraham hesed as well by allowing me to take your daughter to be a bride for Abraham's son?" It's an interesting way to tell a story and provide a gotcha at the end. He's basically saying, God is doing a great thing here, but are you going to be a participant? And of course, their response is, this is the Lord's doing. We have no opinion in the matter. So, this story does end with a happy ending for Eliezer and all parties involved. Rebekah comes back, meets her husband Isaac. Eliezer tells his master's son the happy news, and with very little ceremony, Isaac takes his new bride to the wedding tent. And just like that, Eliezer is gone from the story. This servant is never mentioned again, and while he played a significant part here, he's not the main character. He doesn't get to become master of the house. He doesn't even get to make a name for himself. He is simply a faithful servant who, when everything is said and done, is only providing a good example for us. And it's at this point that it might be fair to try to sympathize with Eleazar just a bit. Was he happy because his master had got the girl? Did Abraham or Isaac ever thank him for his loyalty or for his dedicated service? Well, personally, I think the Bible is silent in all of these issues for a very good reason. This is a story about God and not about Eleazar. And questions like these, while I think they're interesting to ponder, tend to display a certain amount of narcissism. For a culture like ours, we worry whether or not our good deeds are going to influence the world. We worry that we won't get the proper credit or honor or glory for the things that we do. And when we do this sort of speculation, and yes, I include myself in this category, what we're often saying is, if I was Eleazar, I'd want to make sure I got my just reward. But it's at this point where the scandal of the gospel takes over. You see, one of Jesus' most overlooked and probably under-preached teachings, well, at least here in America, that is that God has a very special place for you, and it's probably at the back of the line. Being a citizen in the kingdom of God is its own reward. For example, when discussing John the Baptist, Jesus notes that the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John, and in the same breath, Jesus has called John the Baptist the greatest person who's ever been born of a woman. But then Jesus unpacks his teaching a little bit about the kingdom, and we note that being the least in the kingdom means having a slave position. And let me tell you, my friend, slaves don't get much recognition. Like our friend Eleazar in this story, he shows up only when necessary, and then once the job is done, they fade back into the background. And I believe that this is the major difference between the real gospel of Jesus Christ and the health and wealth and prosperity drivel that often passes for Christianity, at least here in this country. Not everybody gets to be a 5-talent person, my friends. God is probably not calling you to the kind of greatness that will cause you to be remembered by the history books. No, the scandal of the gospel is that there's really only one book where it matters whether or not your name is in it. And if you want to have your name in this book of life, well, a lifestyle of inauspicious servanthood is required for you. What does this life look like? Well, I think our text today points us in a direction. The God who saves us is a God of hesed, of loving kindness that endures forever. Likewise, the people of God latch on to this aspect of God's character, and they become people of hesed themselves. Therefore, my friends, I tell you to go and do likewise. Be people of loyal love and faithfulness, because the God that saves you is a God of loyal love and faithfulness. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-bow! And this presentation was brought to you by a bibliography. In this bibliography, you will find certain books such as Obed Browski's Daily Life in Biblical Times. You will find John Goldengay's Genesis for Everyone, a lovely little commentary that everyone can read. You'll find Victor P. Hamilton's New International Commentary of the Old Testament, which is a little bit more difficult to read than Goldengay. You'll find Wilhelm van Gemmeren's New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, which I recommend strongly learning Hebrew before even tackling. And finally, we have Gordon Winneham's Word Biblical Commentary, Genesis, Volume 2, which is so technical it will make your eyes freak out. But in any case, all of these books went into presenting this lecture you saw today, so enjoy and have a blessed day, my friends.